How do you ensure only citizens vote without disenfranchising citizen voters? I asked this question to Minnesota Secretary of State Steve Simon, and here's his breakdown of the Save America Act that's in Congress right now, that if passed by the Senate, would require Americans to prove their citizenship to register to vote.
What the SAVE Act does, the top line, the headline for the SAVE Act, is it would impose, for the first time in American history, a documentary proof of citizenship requirement, meaning documentary, show us your papers, some paper, some identification that shows citizenship, which driver's license don't necessarily do. And that's new for us in this country. Now, just to say, I totally understand why at first blush, if someone hears that description of this legislation, I completely understand why anyone anywhere would say, well, that sounds kind of reasonable. I mean, there are only a handful of things you need to vote. You need to be a citizen, you need to be 18, you need to be a resident of the place you say you're a resident. What's so wrong with asking someone to prove it with a piece of paper? Right. I get that on the surface, that seems totally reasonable. But this is one of those examples, at least in my opinion, of where the more you look, the less you like. And let me give you an example. So we have 69 million women in America who have a different last name now than the one they were born with. Obviously, the vast majority are those who change their name due to marriage. So what do you do if you're one of the 20 plus million of those folks who don't have a passport? Passport obviously does show proof of citizenship, but if you're one of the 20 plus million American women who have a different last name and don't have a passport, what do you do? What would you show? What are the papers you'd have to show in order to register to vote? And the answer is you'd have to, at the very least, show both a birth certificate and a marriage record. And if you were married more than once, it would be 2 marriage records, because you need to make that link between your birth name and your current name. Now, many people are going to be able to come up with both of those, but too many people are not going to be able to come up with those. And let me give you a real world example in case anyone thinks this is just theoretical. About 15 years ago or so, the state of Kansas experimented with its own statewide version of what we now call the SAVE or Save America Act. In other words, they imposed for state elections a proof of citizenship requirement where you had to show papers. And before a federal judge struck down that law in Kansas, they had an election where that law was in place. And during that election, more than 26,000 eligible Kansans, eligible as you and me, born, raised, U.S. citizens, 26,000 north of that were shut out and turned away because they couldn't come up with that documentation. These are eligible Americans, but they couldn't show the stuff. They couldn't show those multiple documents for proof of citizenship. So all
do you think the purpose of this is to disenfranchise Democratic voters?
You know, what I would say is I'm going to assume for a moment that I'm going to assume the sincerity of those who want what I want and everyone I know want, which is we want clean election rolls. We only want eligible voters to vote, period. So I'm not going to get so much into questioning motives as I am just questioning how this thing would be implemented and how it could, whether intentionally or not, shut out and fence out a lot of eligible voters, people who are citizens, who are residents, who are 18 years old, but can't come up with the papers. Again, first time in American history that I know of that we'd have a show me your papers for citizenship law. So I understand the surface appeal, but once you dig into it and figure out how it's going to be implemented, there are real questions and challenges.
How else would you be able to prove citizenship and ensure that people trust the voting process in that regard so that it's foolproof, right? There's so many claims that are made that elections are tainted and undocumented immigrants are voting, but there's really no proof of that widespread. But still, the criticism exists. How would you defy that in a different way?
Well, I'd say that the way that we have right now in almost every state, I think it's 48 out of the 50 states or 47 out of the 50 states, including Minnesota, is of course you have to attest that you're a citizen. You don't have to show papers, but you have to swear under penalty of perjury that you are. And look at the incentive structure here for someone going against that, right? To vote when you're ineligible to vote when you're not a citizen of the United States is not only a felony, punishable in some cases by long prison terms. It is a deportable offense and a permanent bar to citizenship. Now, that's pretty high stakes. It is very unlikely that someone is going to take that big a risk for something like this. Now, they may take that big a risk for other things, financial fraud or other things like that. But man, one of the reasons why the level of voting amongst non-citizens is really microscopic, certainly in Minnesota, is that it just doesn't make sense that someone would do that. I mean, if any of your viewers have ever met or encountered or come into contact with someone who is, for example, an undocumented immigrant in this country, they look at their shoes a lot, right? I mean, seriously, the last thing they want to do is to come in contact with people from the government or engage in a government process. That's just common sense. At least that's the observation that most people talk about. And that's why in Minnesota, the numbers over the years have been so microscopic.
That's the status quo now. But
Yeah.
what would you do in the future to satiate Republicans who don't think that it's working? Like, how else
Well-
could you do it? Could you have the Social Security Administration check status?
Yeah.
Could you have another way to do it that wouldn't require people in a matter of
Yeah.
a couple months to get all the documents straight?
Yeah, well, let me tell you what we do right now beyond just having people attest and swear an oath punishable by a felony. So right now, we routinely, in some cases daily, screen and filter and run through all the millions of voter registrations in Minnesota through multiple databases. I'm talking about death databases. I'm talking about immigration and law enforcement and court system databases. So we are constantly monitoring and filtering and screening to find things like non-citizens, to find things like immigration red flags and things like that. So that's something that we and all states do right now. And again, you got to look at the numbers, right? It really is a microscopic level.
I reached out to Republican Representatives Tom Emmer and Brad Finstad for their takes on this controversial legislation. I didn't hear back from either of their offices. Emmer has argued that IDs are required for airports and even access to the Democratic National Convention. He called Democrats hypocritical on this issue. President Trump made a clear pitch to Congress during his State of the Union to pass this legislation right away to stop election fraud, which again he falsely claimed occurred en masse last election despite his victory. A Pew poll last year showed 83% of Americans support showing government-issued ID for voting.